Hola, bienvenido. Es para mí un placer presentarte la plenaria número 20, la cual tiene como título Gestión de activos y pasivos de fondos de pensiones ALM o cómo jubilarse ricos, la cual será presentada por Ricardo Matos Chan. Bienvenido, Ricardo. Puedes continuar con tu presentación.
Bom dia, saudações à comunidade latino-americana de Neosistemas, brasileira e a colombiana. Muito agradecido pelo convite para falar sobre minha pesquisa, que é sobre um método utilizado por fundos de pensão, bancos e seguradoras, chamados Asset and Liability Management, que é a gestão de ativos e passivos. Ou, se nós pudermos pensar na perspectiva pessoal, se nós tivéssemos uma disciplina de poupança durante uma vida toda, como se aposentar de uma maneira adequada. O objetivo dessa pesquisa foi identificar fatores de risco em um cenário de riscos e incertezas de longo prazo. E esse objeto desse cenário foram fundos de pensão. Se nós fôssemos tentar explicar o que é um fundo de pensão, nós diríamos que ele é um estoque onde as contribuições dos participantes e dos patrocinadores nutrem, alimentam esse estoque, e a partir desse ponto, ele então contrata a estrutura administrativa, tem despesas correntes, estrutura de investimento, aí é onde ele vai incorrer em taxas de investimento, corretagem, etc. Ele aplica esses recursos no mercado financeiro, seja em títulos de renda fixa, bonds, seja em renda variável, estoques, bolsa de valores, imóveis, patrimônio, ou empréstimos a participantes, para que eles participantes possam comprar imóveis ou possam utilizar esse dinheiro para outros propósitos. Isso retorna na forma de juros, dividendos e outros benefícios, juros sobre capital próprio, etc., né, de empresas. Isso retorna ao fundo de pensão para que ele possa fazer frente no futuro às incertezas relativas aos benefícios que ele vai prometendo para os participantes por meio do seu plano de benefícios. Se nós pensássemos na perspectiva muito pessoal, eu diria assim, por exemplo, eu tenho um jovem hoje que está entrando no mercado de trabalho com 20 anos de idade ou 22 anos de idade. Vamos dizer que ele, né, durante esse período de trabalho, ele inicia uma acumulação de um valor, vamos dizer, em torno de $50, $53, e depois de 30 anos, ou seja, com a idade de 50 ou 52 anos, ele então possa iniciar um processo de saque desse fundo para a aposentadoria. Então, assim, ele entraria na fase de decumulação, uma fase de benefícios, onde ele saca todo mês, e depois de algum tempo, ele zera esse fundo. Então, 30 anos acumulando, 30 anos sacando esse fundo até zerar esse fundo, né? E as incertezas têm a ver com esse cenário aqui. Então, assim, se a acumulação não for adequada, se a rentabilidade não for adequada, ele vai para um outro cenário. Esse é o nosso modo de referência. Se eu fosse enxergar essa dinâmica na perspectiva de um diagrama de estoques e fluxos, eu diria que eu tenho um fundo pessoal, que é alimentado por depósitos e diminuído por retiradas. Eu também tenho um fluxo de aplicação, eu tenho uma taxa de juros que interfere nessa aplicação, e depois de algum tempo, essa retirada ela é calculada, depois de 30 anos, ela é calculada e ela inicia lá no período de benefício. No período de acumulação, ela é zero. Então, mais ou menos esse é o diagrama. E eu preparei uma planilha para demonstrar como é que é essa dinâmica no fundo de pensão. Então, imaginei aqui um jovem iniciando, ele entrou no mercado de trabalho hoje, vamos dizer com 20 anos, no mês que vem, no próximo mês, esse fluxo tem, então, 360 meses ou 30 anos, e mais 360 meses, então 720 tempos de fluxo, né? E esse jovem, ele inicia um depósito mensal de R$300 ou $53, em valores hoje no Brasil, da cotação do Brasil, e ele decide colocar esse dinheiro em lugares diferentes para se proteger, né? Então, diversificar. Ele empresta para o governo, ele empresta para a empresa e ele empresta para o banco. Então, no governo, no Brasil, o Tesouro Direto. Nas empresas é mercado de ações, você fazer uma carteira diversificada, ter boas empresas, empresas sólidas, empresas com bons fundamentos, preferencialmente descontadas, ou seja, que o valor da ação dela está abaixo do preço justo, e R$ 100 em títulos de bancos, por exemplo, CDB. No Brasil nós temos fundo garantidor de crédito, então assim, eu posso aplicar no banco em CDB e tenho lá uma garantia se houver algum problema com o sistema financeiro. Os bancos criaram uma estratégia para isso, mas tem outros ativos também, ativos cambiais, ativos de ouro, baseados em ouro, tem vários ativos que o banco oferece que eu posso recorrer para poder proteger o meu capital. Então, assim, se eu inicio essa gestão no primeiro mês, depois de 60 meses, né, eu já teria acumulado aí 20.931, considerando-se a taxa de 0,5%, que é a taxa atuarial universal. O mundo inteiro usa essa taxa de 0,5% ao mês ou 6% ao ano para fundos de pensão como forma de remuneração. Uma taxa que traz, depois de 60 meses, 20.931, e depois de 60 meses recolhendo R$ 300, eu poderia ficar outros 60 meses sacando os R$ 404, desde que eu decidisse me aposentar aí depois de 60 meses. Se eu esperasse um pouco mais, depois de 120 meses ou 10 anos, eu agora já teria acumulado 49.163 com esses mesmos R$ 300 e poderia ficar mais 120 meses sacando R$ 545. De outra forma, se eu tivesse esperado 180 meses, eu já teria acumulado 87 mil para um retorno aí de R$ 736 pelos mesmos 180 meses. Esperando 240 meses ou 20 anos, eu já teria R$ 138 mil e poderia sacar 993 durante os próximos 20 anos. Querendo esperar um pouco mais, 25 anos, eu teria 207.898, sacando aí 1.339, ou depois de 60 meses, eu então teria acumulado 301 mil e fazendo frente aí mais outros 30 anos de 1.806. Então, você pode observar que 30 anos depositando R$ 300 ou $52, 30 anos sacando R$ 1.806,77. Claro que esse aqui é um modelo simplificado, a gente tem que considerar outras dinâmicas da economia, e esse era o objetivo de estudo, compreender que dinâmicas são essas, que preocupações, que fatores são esses. Depois, então, assim, se depois de passado o tempo, 360 meses, ele entra em aposentadoria. O cálculo que ele faz aqui agora é sobre o montante acumulado, ele já não deposita mais nada, e ele passa a ter direito àquele benefício de R$ 1.806,51. Se essa taxa, agora então é o seguinte, essa é a perspectiva mais conservadora no fundo de pensão, essa é a promessa dos fundos de pensão no mundo todo. Se o fundo de pensão tiver uma gestão melhor um pouquinho do seu patrimônio, que ele vai acumulando, né, ele passa então agora a ter a possibilidade não de 2.211, então com uma rentabilidade agora de 0,66, emprestando e organizando melhor esse investimento, eu teria então agora um benefício mensal de R$ 3.281, mais ou menos, tá? E com 1%, essa planilha atualizada, então eu teria 10.784,89 de benefício, e aqui está a distribuição, isso equivale a uma renda mensal de $1.878. Com uma gestão melhor um pouquinho, 1,2%, ele então agora estaria na casa de 21 mil por mês, então, tendo recolhido durante 30 anos R$ 300, ele poderá, durante os próximos 30 anos, sacar R$ 21.983, desde que ele mantenha essa taxa de acumulação, correto? E então ele teria 3.289, então ele poderia chegar, por exemplo, a 1,5, a 11.116. Por que esses números? Esses números são números perfeitamente possíveis de se conseguir com a gestão no banco. Por exemplo, alguns fundos de infraestrutura que o banco oferece por meio das empresas, eles remuneram em torno de 1,8% ao mês, só para ter uma ideia, né? Então, assim, Essa gestão complexa tem que ser diversificada, você vai pegar ativos que dão retorno baixo, ativos que dão retorno alto, e então a ideia é não ficar exposto tanto assim, né? Esse benefício, ele considera essa taxa de 0,0015, aqui no caso 1,5%. Se o participante decidir sacar tudo isso e colocar na poupança, no rendimento super conservador, então ele tem uma queda aqui no benefício dele, de 63.811, ele cairia para 25.048. Avaliar 74, a cotação do dólar, 4 mil dólares. De 11 mil, ele cai para 4 mil dólares. Então, assim, as decisões que vai se tendo ao longo do tempo, elas influenciam nesse retorno esperado. Então, ele tem uma dinâmica, ele guarda uma dinâmica em si importante. Tá? O fundo de pensão, ele tem lá dentro dele processos que possibilitam que ele crie o plano de benefícios e faça a gestão desse plano de benefícios, atualize ela. Também ele vai criar um plano de investimento para exatamente projetar que tipo de retorno que ele poderá ter no futuro, e um plano de custeio. Esses 3 planos passam por um processo de avaliação, onde os métodos, premissas atuariais e as modalidades definem como será feita essa avaliação. O método é o ALM, a modalidade é a contribuição definida ou benefício definido. No caso, a contribuição definida é como nós fizemos nessa planilha agora, você define quanto vai contribuir para que você projete lá no futuro quanto você vai receber. O benefício definido é o inverso, você fala assim, eu vou entregar para esse funcionário no futuro o equivalente ao salário dele atual. Então, para isso, aí agora eu tenho uma complexidade muito maior e esse era o objetivo de estudo, entender essa complexidade. Então, esse processo de avaliação entrega indicadores de desempenho, entrega estratégias para otimização dos investimentos. Aqui a Dinâmica Sistemas ajuda muito. Também entrega um fluxo de caixa de ativo e passivo, para que seja possível fazer o casamento desse ativo e passivo, e uma estratégia de investimentos. O que se busca também é avaliar a liquidez do fundo e a solvência. A diferença entre liquidez e solvência é que a liquidez ela é de curto e médio prazo, e está fazendo frente aos pagamentos mais imediatos que estão acontecendo. Pense um fundo com 1.000 participantes, e depois de algum tempo, desses 1.300 se aposentam, e o fundo tem que ter liquidez para poder manter esses 300, e essa liquidez vem muito dela da contribuição dos participantes, mas também do retorno dos investimentos. E a solvência é lá na frente, quando os 1.000 já estiverem aposentados, ele vai agora só está sacando os seus recursos, e agora ele tem riscos de mercado, riscos de liquidez e riscos de crédito, no sentido de que os títulos que ele escolheu para investir, eles podem não devolver o que se imaginava. Então, essa é a liquidez. Então, assim, o que explica essa dinâmica que a gente acabou de discutir? O juros compostos do longo prazo. Eles embora o retorno seja fixo, como a gente pode verificar aqui na planilha, o retorno sempre é o retorno da taxa de juros, né? Mas os juros compostos e o reinvestimento, ele explica essa questão. E o longo prazo, né? A dinâmica da passagem do tempo, uma boa alocação de ativos, uma boa estratégia de alocação de ativos. No Brasil, os fundos de pensão, na estatística de uns 5 anos atrás, eles variavam entre 1,5% a 2,3% ao mês. Eles conseguiam esse tipo de rentabilidade. Então, aquele número de 1,5% para demonstrar o que eles conseguem. E que você também pode conseguir no mercado financeiro normal, entendeu? Fazendo sua própria gestão de fundos. E, principalmente, controlar as despesas, uma gestão prudencial, não expor todo o patrimônio em ativos de altíssimo risco, e manter os retornos por meio de posições de proteção. O mercado de derivativos, ele, para quem está exposto em bolsa de valores, ele é utilizado exatamente para proteger, tem técnicas para fazer isso, para se proteger dessa exposição. Então, assim, o Asset and Liability Management, ele tem a ver com a solvência e a liquidez. Ele é um método que preocupa com a solvência e a liquidez. Ele tem que ter uma capacidade de valuation, de criar um valor, de descobrir o valor dos ativos e também dos passivos de longo prazo, considerando-se várias vários cenários futuros possíveis, falecimento do participante, várias hipóteses também, né? Aumento de salários, aumento de valor de benefício, o valor de benefício estava previsto em 10, passou a 12, inflação, taxa de câmbio, taxa de juros variáveis, enfim, né? Avaliar também a empresa e os projetos de investimento dessas empresas, para que a gente possa estimar os fluxos de caixa dessas empresas e os retornos que se espera. Fundos multimercado no Brasil, eles trabalham com investir em ativos que tenham a possibilidade de dar um retorno acima de 20%. Então, essas carteiras, elas querem buscar esse tipo de coisa. E, principalmente, a gestão dos riscos de incerteza, que era objeto desse estudo. Algumas disciplinas ajudam a matemática financeira, por exemplo, cenários prospectivos e complexos, e a capacidade de avaliar ciclos de mercado e analisar esses ciclos de mercado. Os princípios são paradigmas atuariais, valuation dos ativos e alocação estocástica. O LM se apoia muito na alocação estocástica de ativos e na estimação dos passivos também de forma estocástica. O objetivo do ALM é caracterizar essa complexidade envolvida e visualizar cenários de longo prazo, que vai considerando aí riscos e incertezas inerentes ao mercado de seguros. Encontrar a melhor combinação de ativos para melhorar ou maximizar de maneira intertemporal a probabilidade dos planos de benefícios alcançar seus objetivos, na visão das premissas estabelecidas. Também incrementar a solvência, as condições de solvência dos planos, pela minimização da volatilidade dos rendimentos acumulados. Essa volatilidade tem a ver, por exemplo, com isso. Olha, esse aqui, por exemplo, é o Ibovespa brasileiro, a Bolsa Brasileira. E essa subida gera uma volatilidade. Essa estabilidade aqui, ó, né? Isso aqui é uma baixa volatilidade, aqui eu tenho alta volatilidade, aqui eu tenho alta volatilidade, aqui eu tenho altíssima volatilidade. Isso aqui coincidiu com o coronavírus. E hoje, no dia de hoje, o mercado brasileiro está exatamente nesse número, 100.552, esse é o gráfico no dia 22 de outubro de 2020. Essa é a volatilidade. A gestão disso, né, tem a ver com a solvência, assim, também dos fundos de pensão, na parte que está exposta em renda variável. Prover um fluxo de caixa também suficiente para pagar essas obrigações do plano e redução da liquidez, dos riscos de liquidez, estimação dos riscos atuariais e por meio de simulações estocásticas dos passivos e também dos ativos, ele visualizar cenários e analisar a estrutura do atuarial dos passivos, de maneira a sugerir uma otimização dos portfólios. Então, assim, o que se busca com a LM é analisar como o mercado está trabalhando, que tipos de ativos estão disponíveis, que oportunidades podem haver para o fundo no longo prazo, considerando uma alocação e um rebalanceamento de carteira, para que então se possa estimar esse rebalanceamento, para que se possa otimizar esse investimento. Então, se nós fôssemos formular o que seria a dinâmica no fundo de pensão, nós poderíamos dizer que ela tem a ver com o volume de participantes que ele possui. Novos planos de benefício, alguns fundos de pensões têm vários planos de benefício. Novos planos de benefício atraem novos participantes, que geram mais contribuições, que geram mais alocação de ativos, mais ganhos de capital, mais alocação de ativos aqui, e mais credibilidade, que gera novos participantes. Então, eu tenho aqui dois loops de reforço e seus respectivos loops de balanço, que é o pagamento de pensões, o custo de transações, o controle de perdas e a alocação de ativos. Esses elementos, então, juntos, compõem o que a gente pode dizer que é a dinâmica do fundo de pensão. As variáveis econômicas que nós identificamos na pesquisa são as bem importantes, que são consideradas nas equações matemáticas envolvidas nos cálculos atuariais, são taxa de juros, rentabilidade do investimento, salários, valores de benefícios da Previdência Social e inflação. As variáveis demográficas são mortalidade de válidos e inválidos, entrada em invalidez, geração futura de novos entrados, rotatividade de composição familiar, e outras seriam idade da aposentadoria, idade de entrada no emprego, taxa de contribuição, né? Esses, então, foram diagramas de fluxo amplos, né, com outras questões, como, por exemplo, longevidade, e tem a ver com mortalidade, estudos populacionais em fundos de pensão, as metas atuariais, como elas estão projetadas, índice de rotatividade, o funcionário sai de um lugar e vai para o outro, ele leva parte da poupança dele no fundo, e basicamente dois dois estoques, ativos e passivos, que é o estudo da LM, ativos e passivos. Então, a gente chega no fluxo de caixa, a gente chega aqui num desenho onde Então, assim, a ideia é projetar aqui, ó, eu tenho um modelo, esse modelo ele é rodado, e você tem o resultado, então, dos ativos, e ele é rodado mais de uma vez, é rodado rodado 500 vezes, então nós vamos ter uma faixa de valores, né, que vai nos representar, que vai nos ajudar a compreender que tipo de gestão, que tipo de oportunidades, ou que tipo de defasagem está acontecendo nesse plano, ou que pode acontecer. É aí que está os estudos de ALM residem nesse ponto, tá? Então, por exemplo, isso aqui é uma solvência e liquidez do fundo de pensão estudado, e a que estava buscando aqui era a solvência. Então, a solvência do fundo, ela poderia estar, aqui a média, né? E aqui seriam os valores maiores e os menores que ele poderia estar incorrendo, né? Depois de algum tempo. Aqui, no caso, foram 30 anos, de 2010 a 2040, 30 anos de projeção para que a gente pudesse enxergar, e aqui o fluxo de caixa, ou para fazer frente à liquidez. Então, assim, que tipo de preocupação que a gestão deve ter e qual o desenho que o fundo está gravando nessa figura, para que a gente possa, então, ter uma ideia de como seria a alocação e como estaria a estrutura do ativos. Nesse processo, ele pode identificar déficit, e o que ele faz é pedir para que os participantes retornem ou façam novos aportes para poder equilibrar atuarialmente o fundo. Essa é a visão do ALM. Bom, quase finalizando, depois de algum tempo, os custos dos planos de benefícios têm a ver com alguns fatores. O nível dos riscos atuariais assumidos pelo plano. Alguns planos prometem para os participantes e consideram algumas premissas como sobrevivência do participante, mortalidade, por exemplo, se esse participante trabalha no setor, por exemplo, uma siderurgia, onde ele tem ele está exposto a uma morte mais recente, ao contrário de uma pessoa que trabalha no banco, por exemplo, né? Ele opera máquinas, então ele tem algumas premissas que são consideradas, tá? Mortalidade, desemprego dos participantes e as pensões necessárias para sua família. Então, também ele considera a família, por exemplo, que a ideia do benefício previdenciário é de proteger contra perda de capacidade laboral. Então, na hipótese de morte, essa pensão ela vai para os familiares, para a mulher, para a esposa, no caso de um homem, né, ou para o marido, no caso de uma mulher, ou para os filhos menores. Os filhos maiores geralmente ficam fora do plano. Então, assim, o plano trabalha todas essas premissas e a qualidade da gestão dos riscos envolvidos e também a performance dos investimentos, do portfólio de investimentos do fundo, e também o custo geral de gestão e supervisão da entidade. Então, todos esses elementos compõem o custo, e então a gente chegou, no final da pesquisa, entre várias conclusões, essa foi a principal delas, é que para cada fase dessa nós temos decisões possíveis. Então, por exemplo, na fase de acumulação ele decide alocar estrategicamente os ativos. Na maturidade ele está menos preocupado com essa alocação e está mais preocupado em ter pagamentos pontuais. Em todos os estágios ele está preocupado em implementar novos planos de benefícios para que ele tenha novos participantes e aumente a riqueza do fundo, uma melhor gestão de ativos, menores custos, manter a solvência adequada e manter altos rendimentos. E aí, então, nós chegamos não aos fatores dos diagramas de loops causais ou dos diagramas de estoques e fluxos, mas os fatores de risco que estão envolvidos em cada fase, para que a gente pudesse compreender que ações que são realizadas em cada fase para que se proteja ou que se mitigue esse risco ou se transfira esse risco. Como, por exemplo, interesse em mais adesões para reduzir custos e obter maior acumulação, né? Enfim, essa foi, então, a nossa conclusão. As lições aprendidas da pesquisa foram: jovens, pensem em aposentadoria muito cedo na vida. Não deixem para pensar muito tarde, não fiquem achando que a vida não corre muito rápido. Inicie suas contribuições e mantenha as contribuições de maneira regular. Você viu que o que você tem que fazer é uma boa gestão dos juros que você vai obter. Esses juros, eles estão embutidos nos ativos nos quais você vai colocar, e eles têm a ver com, com decisões que você vai tomar. Eu vou tirar o dinheiro de um determinado fundo, vou colocar de um determinado ativo, vou colocar no outro. Esse rebalanceamento é necessário. Pense numa alocação estratégica como as duas regras de Warren Buffett. Ele fala, nunca perca dinheiro e nunca se esqueça da primeira regra. A segunda regra é não se esqueça da primeira regra. Isso quer dizer o quê? Não invista em empresas que não valem a pena. Benjamin Graham, professor de Warren Buffett, dizia no livro dele, The Intelligent Investor, ele falava sobre as estratégias de investimento passiva ou ativa. Então, essa passiva, ela você separa esse dinheiro e aloca em boas empresas, esperando que elas cresçam e prosperem no futuro, e esse prosperar é suficiente para que você atinja aqueles objetivos. Mantenha reservas de segurança, de maneira que você possa estar sempre investindo com a simetria positiva. O que é isso? Em algumas situações, a dinâmica do mercado, por exemplo, essas situações de queda, ela derruba as cotações das empresas e as empresas ficam baratas em relação ao valor de mercado delas. É nesse momento que você tem que fazer aportes, aumentar os seus aportes, como? Por meio da reserva de segurança. Obtenha vantagens dos ciclos para incrementar as posições. Rebalance e proteja o seu portfólio de ativos. Mantenha posições defensivas por meio de ativos com baixa correlação entre eles. Por exemplo, aplique no banco em ouro, aplique em bolsa de valores, aplique em renda fixa, de maneira que você possa trabalhar essa correlação. Analise o beta das carteiras para compreender que tipo de correlação positiva ou negativa entre ativos você pode ter. Controle seus custos, despesas e investimentos, trabalhe muito e invista fortemente na sua carreira. É a sua carreira que te assegura esse retorno regular de capital e te assegura essa última coisa, ser grato e viver com alegria e completude. Eu queria muito agradecer de novo ao comitê organizador do CLADES, agradecer pelos amigos que estão por aí. Muitas graças. Hasta pronto. E me quedo à disposição para outras inquietudes que podem ter. Mi correo es esto. Muchas gracias.
Fue una presentación muy completa. Muchas gracias. Les recuerdo a nuestros oyentes seguir nuestras publicaciones con el numeral CLAS 2020.
Hola, quiero reiterarte la invitación a participar en nuestro Congreso Latinoamericano y Encuentro Colombiano de Dinámica de Sistemas, que llevaremos a cabo de forma virtual del 26 al 30 de octubre de 2020. Estamos muy felices, hemos hecho una convocatoria muy amplia, tanto en plenarias, van a haber sorpresas muy interesantes, tendremos plenarias de todo el mundo, con temas muy interesantes que sé que serán de su agrado y serán del interés de la comunidad. Y la respuesta ha sido fabulosa, ya llevamos 80 trabajos sometidos y tenemos este último fin de semana para enviar los trabajos, así que anímate, este va a ser un evento tremendamente interesante, tremendamente productivo, no te lo pierdas. Un abrazo, que estés muy bien.
Continuamos con la plenaria número 21, la cual tiene como título Modelado de políticas del COVID-19 y será presentada por Karim. Bienvenido, Karim. Éxitos en tu presentación.
Good day. My name is Karim Shishakli. I'm from IC Systems and from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I want to talk about modeling some COVID-19 policies that were in Brazil and in the United States, 2 different cases. The first case is going to look at the effectiveness of vertical isolation, which was the type of shutdown that was proposed in Brazil. And then we're going to look at the economic impacts of shutdowns. Vertical isolation is the idea that we isolate some people who we think are more vulnerable and we don't isolate other people, versus horizontal isolation where everyone gets quarantined, for example. At IC Systems, we did a bunch of SEIR modeling when the pandemic started. We had 3 or 4 different models, maybe more, but we had a bunch of models we were playing around, and we noticed a few things. First of all, the standard SEIR model leads to a much lower average residence time than we expect. So we say we want the average residence time to be 5, but the problem is it isn't 5 because the largest fraction leaves a stock in an SEIR model, standard SEIR model, at the very beginning, immediately. And that's because it's a first order material delay. We also noticed that there was a strong correlation between age and symptoms, severity, behavior, yet most models disaggregate by severity but aggregate symptom presentation, severity, they aggregate behavior. They don't separate them out. So the idea of this first model we're looking at is that if you disaggregate by age, you can catch some new dynamics. In particular, you can check things like vertical isolation, which is a policy that's age specific. Let's just look at material delays for a minute and see what happens. If I have this pulse input to a material delay, I show the first order response, which is again the first order material delay is what is used in an SEIR model. Okay, so we see that the largest fraction leaves at the very beginning. A third order is a little later. Some leaves clear near the beginning. Remember, here we have a delay length of 5. So this, ideally, your center point's going to be here. So 6th order and 9th order get a lot closer to here. The 3rd order is a little behind, but you know, it really depends how they're distributed around this. Again, a first order material delay, this is what it looks like. It's a a draining process. And this is the E and I part of an SEIR model. We have a stock of exposed, but so they're carrying it, but they don't have symptoms, and infected, they have it, and they are showing symptoms. And to get there, we have a flow that's just exposed divided by the time to show symptoms. That's the flow. A third order takes this stock and flow and expands it into 3. The order is just the number of stocks we have in the delay. So here we have 3 stocks. And the time for each one is just this divided by 3 because it's third order. Now, if we want some arbitrary order stock, there's a trick that we can do without having to show all that mess, all those extra stocks in the middle. John Sterman suggests this in his book in the cases where we need an nth order delay, and we need to know the stock value, the underlying stock value, because if we don't express it by a number of stocks, we don't know the stock value because the built-ins don't tell us. And that is to connect the inflow to the outflow and derive the outflow from a built-in function like delay 3. So the outflow of exposed is no longer based on what's in exposed, it's based on the inflow, and we're doing a material delay, third order, delay 3, or 6th order here. And this works fine because this function has all those stocks underneath. So we still have a bunch of stocks connecting these. We just don't see them. Unfortunately, the simple trick doesn't work if you have multiple outflows from a stock, for example, for testing. I have a blog entry here that talks about how to do that. And I can show you this model that I used. This is a macro that I used that created a multi-stage delay with multiple outflows to make this work. And that's what I used in the model, by the way, that we're going to look at. So the standard SEIR model, we have a stock of susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. Exposed is, they have it, but they don't have any symptoms. They may or may not be contagious. For COVID-19, they are contagious. So we have this trick that we're using here for becoming infected. So we're using an nth order delay here. And then we do the same thing to become from being infected to recovering. We're also using a distribution an nth order delay here based on the time to recover. So we're using the same trick for both of those. And you should remember, if these are contagious, then the sum of those are the people who can make these people sick. So probability that they will contact someone who's susceptible times the number of contacts there can be are the contacts of these people with these people, and that's how many will become exposed. Well, there's an infection rate too. It's not 100%. It's much, much, much lower. Right? Just because I run into someone who's sick doesn't mean I'll get sick. Okay. If I add testing, though, it becomes more complicated. Now I have people who are exposed but no symptoms, but I've tested them and they're positive. We're going to quarantine them, and then they're eventually going to become infected also while they're quarantined. People who are showing symptoms, I'm going to want to quarantine. And then those people are going to recover, as are the infected people originally. So it's a bit more complicated with testing. And I need that other structure that I just showed. Now, if I want to disaggregate it by age, it becomes even more complicated. Okay, so I may have some time in here where they're exposed but not really showing symptoms. By age, they may have mild or no symptoms and be in here, right? And then we're not going to quarantine them because we don't know they're sick. So that can make a difference. But everything here is disaggregated by age. Everything's a rate at this point. And you'll notice, so it's a much, much bigger model. And you'll notice there are also deaths from those who are infected and quarantined, assuming that if they had symptoms enough to be quarantined, there's a severity in there. There are some people who are severe enough that they will die. The contact fractions are determined from the population based on ages, and we have here contact fractions by age in China. I actually came up with my own set of numbers that ended up matching this almost exactly. It's kind of freaky. But this data is readily available. And then there's a symptomatic fraction, those who have symptoms by age. And that is on the next page, the data for that. And then we also have death rates by age. That also, all those numbers came from China. So these are the contact fractions I used. The ages, those who are 0 to 9, with people who are 0 to 9 and et cetera all the way up. You'll notice that I used 10 to 15 instead of 10 to 19 and then 16 to 29. I put these in the same group because these people operate somewhat independently, whereas these are still somewhat under parental control. So their behavior is different. So even though everything here is a decade, these I did not do that way to capture that dynamic. Symptomatic fractions are here. You'll notice it's higher as you get older. Death fractions as well get higher as you get older, even though I'm not showing those here. I didn't divide also into mild, severe, and critical. You could do that, but I didn't. And you could also calculate what it should be by using aggregate fractions, right? You don't necessarily need to divide it in the model. You can find the model on the IC Exchange in the IC sample models, by the way. This is the full path, but let's go play with that model briefly somewhere over here. Oh, that's the PowerPoint, sorry. There it is. Okay, so here we have the only policy choices we have are horizontal isolation, vertical isolation, and vertical isolation with closed schools. If I run this model in the base case, which is here, which is horizontal isolation, we've quarantined everybody. We have this kind of pattern. We have about 1,000 deaths. This is out of 1 million. We have, by age group, the older people are dying more, but we can see that more easily here. We can see there were not that many people who actually got sick. This is how many people recovered. So the total number of people who got sick are here because that's how many recovered. And we can see the top of the scale is 453 and 1,000 here. But 453, remember that. Remember this. 50 is way down, age 50, age 40, really low. And let's turn on vertical isolation. So in vertical isolation, we're just isolating the elderly. No one else. Notice there's a dramatic change. First of all, a lot more people get sick and a lot more people recover. A lot more people die, 7 times the number of people die. You'll notice the distribution here. This was 473 or something, 400 something. It's now 2.5K. So a lot more older people died. But notice a lot more people who were younger died as well. This was way down here. This was like way down here. These are all, people died at all ages. So this really doesn't work. And then if we add in, we can then also close the schools. There's been a lot of research that shows that children in schools are vectors for bringing disease back to their families and spreading it through communities. And by closing schools or by vaccinating children, we can reduce the spread of disease through a community. If we do that, we can see things are much better again. They're not as good as they were, but they're still pretty good. You'll notice that the age 50 group is still hit harder than it was before, and there are plenty of reasons for that, which we won't actually go into in this right now. This is with a city size of 1 million. If we have a larger city size, things get much worse. These are our parameters that we can set, by the way, the length of the quarantine and the effectiveness of the quarantine by age, and then the size of the city. You'll notice if we start again, and let's reset everything. So for a large city, there's not a big deal, but vertical isolation, we all of a sudden have tremendous number of deaths, 200,000 deaths. Why? Because there are more people who can become infected. There are more people who are going to die, period. Okay, enough on that. That's depressing enough, don't you think? So conclusions. Vertical isolation as a strategy, which, by the way, Bolsonaro was calling for that in Brazil, but the U.S. people were calling for this also in April. Open up everything and just keep the elderly and sick at home. The conclusion is vertical isolation does cost lives, and that's in all age groups, not just in the elderly. The effects are much larger in larger communities. If you turn on vertical isolation, we had a lot more, hundreds of thousands of deaths. And in Latin America and other countries where multiple generations, or cities even in the U.S., where multiple generations live in the same house, the impacts of vertical isolation are much worse because everyone's mixing with everyone, whether or not they stay at home or not. Vertical isolation with closed schools can work in some cases, but again, if you have multi-generational homes, there is still a problem. Okay? So that's my vertical isolation. Interesting things. Let's look at economic impacts of coronavirus, and we'll turn back to the United States for that. Although I did talk about the United States at the end there, about how some people were calling for vertical isolation in April. Earlier this year, we had shutdowns across the world. There were lots of them. Stay-at-home orders, don't go out, close your businesses, etc. We're likely to see more of these before this is over. Hopefully, they're all going to be local or regional. We've already seen some, by the way. And they have been localized. They haven't been everybody. But these shutdowns can have large economic impacts because businesses can collapse because they're closed. They can't keep paying their bills. They can't stay in business. And people are then not employed. And so they lose their ability to make money to survive, pay their rent for their homes, their mortgages, whatever, for food. That's pretty important. Health bills, health insurance in the United States. And we have this vicious cycle, this downward spiral that gets created as income becomes lower, the ability to spend becomes less, and the economy gets hurt by that because the economy depends on people spending money. So the question is, can government policies mitigate some of these impacts? In the United States, they passed the CARES Act in late March. What it gave were loans that can be forgiven. These were given to small businesses, and if you don't cut payroll, they can be completely forgiven. You don't have to pay them back ever, so they become gifts. And this was called the Payroll Protection Program, and it was designed to keep people employed. and to keep businesses running. They could spend some of that money for their business, for rent and things like that. They also extended the unemployment benefits for 3 additional months, which in most places made it for 6 months total. And because it was 3 months, it's 3 months in most states. This is similar to what Obama did in 2009 when he extended unemployment benefits for a year. They added a $600 per week. No checking on what anyone was making before. $600 per week unemployment bonus through July 31st. So everyone on unemployment got $600 extra per week, which is $30,000 a year, by the way. It's actually, if we want to get serious, get exact, it's $31,200 a year. Quite a bit of money. And I will refer to this as the unemployment stimulus. I'll try to remember to do that because there are the PPP, this is the Payroll Protection Program, is also a stimulus. And there's also this $1,200 stimulus payment one time that was given to everyone making less than $75,000 a year. If you made more up to $99,000, you got a little less until it was zero at $99,000. In any case, it also included $500 per child. And there was also, and I didn't model that, by the way, because it's just a one-time, I'm not sure that had a big impact. There's also a 6-month eviction moratorium for people who are renting and a mortgage payment moratorium where you could rewrite your mortgage and just pay interest for the 6 months and then go back to paying your mortgage after that. So those, I didn't model that either. So those are the things that were added, that were now available. Now I modeled this by looking at the number of businesses, people who are in business, whether or not they're open or not. And the more businesses there are, the more businesses will be open. The more businesses that are open, the more likely there will be more businesses that open. But the important thing is when the stay-at-home order happens, the number of businesses open goes down. And after a delay, the number of businesses that still are around goes down also. The more businesses that are open, the more jobs there are, the more income there are from jobs, and therefore there's more spending. This is the loop I was talking about on the previous slide. And the more spending there is, the more jobs there can be. The more businesses are open, the more spending there is by businesses also. The more jobs there are, the less unemployment. But let's look at it the other way. The fewer jobs there are, the more unemployment. The more unemployment, the higher the unemployment benefits. The benefits give them money to spend, which helps. The more spending there is, the more businesses survive. And that creates a reinforcing loop here and a balancing loop all the way out here, all through here. There's also another reinforcing loop through here. And the higher the unemployment, the more likely people will save. The savings rate will go up. So spending will go down. And in fact, this is what happened. The marginal propensity to save in the United States went up to 13%. It was about 6 or 7. And this is not only by people who are employed, but you're giving people $1,200 stimulus check, and you're giving them an unemployment stimulus, the ones who aren't working, $600. For a lot of them, it was more than they were making. They could save some of that away too, and maybe they did for a rainy day, right? I don't know how many did or didn't, but they could. And the savings rate went up quite a bit. So that slows things down again. The unemployment stimulus here helps increase the unemployment benefits. That's the $600 per week, and also the larger length of time. And the stimulus also went to businesses to help them stay around a lot longer. The model here is also in the IC Systems sample models on the IC Exchange. Here's the link to it. And let's go play with that model. Hopefully we can find that one. Here we go. So this model, let's just run it. And this is assuming a shutdown for 2.5 months with a gradual return to normal after that. It starts here, and we have an unemployment rate that goes up. We have the number of businesses falling, the total business revenue falling. So you can see the effects on the economy, and the unemployment rate is quite high. Now, let us play with the unemployment benefits. If we extend the length of unemployment benefits, after turning this on, after turning on the stimulus, if we change the length of the unemployment stimulus, you can see it's impacting first of all, the unemployment rate's going down, number of businesses surviving is higher, and you can also see that as this gets longer, there's more revenue out here. You can see that change. Let's reset that. And of course, if we change the amount of money they get, if there's less money, there's less business revenue, right? And there are fewer businesses. If we increase it, it does help up to a point. It doesn't make a big difference much beyond where it was. The real thing to look at, though, is the payroll protection program, PPP. If we increase this, if we just even introduce this, we can see it has a huge impact. The unemployment rate falls because we're keeping all those people employed now. The number of business that survives goes up, the revenue goes up, so there's still some impact in the long term to the economy, but this is making a big difference. This is actually a really good program. You can see if they make it even longer, instead of 8 weeks, it was 8 weeks. It actually has, a really good impact on things. There are some parameters. No, there are no parameters, sorry. Okay. Conclusions from this model. So stay-at-home orders have effects of making businesses fail in the short run, and in the long term, where long could be, 2 to 3 months. Well, let's talk longer because unemployment benefits run out after that. But people suffer and the economy contracts. We saw that in the model. The CARES Act policies that helped mitigate these effects were investing in the small businesses. The payroll protection program was really good. Kept people employed. We could see that in the model. Extending unemployment allowed people to survive. The unemployment stimulus helped boost the economy in the short run because people had the money to be able to spend so that we didn't have businesses failing. So that also helped businesses stay around. That $1,200 thing did a short little burst, but I'm not convinced that did much of anything. Consider the fact that two $600 2 weeks of the unemployment bonus or stimulus was $1,200. There were some unintended consequences, though, of the CARES Act. 2/3 of the unemployed people were making more money on unemployment than they were working. So they didn't want to return to work until those benefits expired at the end of July. And some people actually left their jobs voluntarily to try to collect that extra money because they could make more money. I didn't model this either, but I didn't model rent, but the whole mitigation, the whole moratorium on evictions from rentals, great. So you don't pay your rent for 3 months. What happens when all of a sudden you can be evicted after that time, or 6 months? You can't ever catch up. You're 6 months behind on your rent. You haven't been able to pay it. You can't pay it now. And by the way, you were probably just barely squeezing by before. How are you going to possibly make up for that? You're going to get evicted. And in fact, that is what happened. A bunch of people got evicted as soon as that ran out. In a few moments, we'll take questions if you have any. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Muy buena presentación. Felicitaciones. Les recuerdo a nuestros oyentes que cualquier duda o inquietud que tengan respecto a esta plenaria o a algunas otras contribuciones, pueden hacerlo por medio de la herramienta interactiva SLab.
Hola, soy el profesor Johnny Valencia de la Universidad de Aysén y los estoy invitando para que este año se inscriban y participen en el Congreso Latinoamericano de Dinámica de Sistemas. Será una excelente oportunidad para que entre todos compartamos los trabajos, los avances y los desarrollos que desde la ciencia del modelado y la simulación estamos haciendo. Hablaremos de temas de energía, de agro, de sostenibilidad, de diseño de políticas y podremos fortalecer las redes con las que pues, nos interesa tanto cada vez estructurar soluciones para nuestra sociedad. Un abrazo muy grande desde la Patagonia chilena y nos vemos en el Congreso.
Por último, pero no menos importante, tenemos la plenaria número 22, que tiene como título Un modelo de dinámica de sistemas de COVID-19 para el este de Inglaterra, a cargo de Paulo Goncalves. Bienvenido, Paulo. Puedes iniciar tu presentación. Muchos éxitos.
Thank you, and welcome to the 18th Latin America System Dynamics Conference in 2020. So I was invited to present some of the work that I have been doing in creating a system dynamics model of COVID-19 for the East of England. This work is joint work with the University of Cambridge, the Judge Business School, in the Center for Health Leadership and Enterprise, Public Health England, and the Università della Svizzera Italiana, where I reside. As you can see, we have a number of colleagues that contributed to this work, professors, PhD students, postdocs, and fellows of the Judge, all of which contributed to the work that I will be presenting here today. In effect, when we think about our goal, we aimed at providing decision support to public health officials in the East of England so that they could make informed and short-term COVID-19 related capacity plans through real-time and participatory modeling. We, even though I am going to present mainly the work associated with system dynamics, you will see that we have built a portfolio of models that strive to reach a balance between rigor and speed in the face of uncertainty and a changing situation, which was the reality associated with COVID-19. And then, even though we hear in the news the national models that were informing some of the predictions, our emphasis was on a regional focus to help understand the pandemic's progression in a specific area, as well as to inform the public officials that had to translate national forecasts to specific actions in that area. So we had, our group of researchers were involved in answering a number of questions and actually developing a number of different models. So just to give you a flavor for the types of things that we were concerned, so first we developed some work focusing on short-term warning systems. So the answer that we were trying to, or the question that we were trying to answer was how many hospital beds at the general ward and ICU beds will be needed for COVID-19 patients over the coming 2 weeks, right? So we developed a time series analysis model that focused on predicting the acute bed occupancy levels, ICU level beds, mainly because that was a concern for policy officials. And the goal there was to indicate whether there was a need to trigger emergency surge capacity. Then, when we developed models to estimate RT, right, so the specific reproduction number at a specific point in time, we basically wanted to answer the question, well, what is the current disease dynamic in the East of England and some of its subregions, right? So this was basically a risk stratification tool to estimate effective reproduction numbers, and that allowed us to identify hotspots and at-risk areas, right? So the goal of this type of model was to inform regional management about potential changes so that we can ensure that they can cope with demand and redirect resources to those hotspots and the at-risk areas. With respect to system dynamics, we were trying to take a look at the medium and long-term planning and also develop some scenario, analysis or what-if analysis. And the question that we're trying to answer here was, what will capacity demand be in relation to the pandemic in the next several months? Now, we use system dynamics. We developed some scenarios, and the system dynamics model incorporated policy and behavioral elements that influence the trajectory of the disease. I will spend a lot more time talking about the model and some of the insights. And here we were interested in assessing the short and medium-term impact of government interventions and population behavior, both on hospital demand. Finally, our last model, looking at restoration and recovery, tries to answer the question of how should the health system restore services such to address the backlog in mental health, right? So there were other types of health services that were also in backlog, but we focused in mental health. And here there were, a series of analyses combined with lit review and simple models that focused on disease prevalence. And the goal here was to estimate how long it would take to basically handle the unobserved waiting list for mental health services. Now, as I mentioned, for the rest of the talk, we're going to focus on the system dynamics application, and in particular how we worked with the Public Health England and our collaboration with different universities to have an impact and to inform decision-making using system dynamics. So looking at these medium and long-term plans required that we integrate not only the disease progression, so you can think of this as the demand generated by the progression of the disease, the demand for hospital services. But we saw the impact, and then we modeled the supply, right? So the hospital services that were available. Also, we captured the impact that morbidity and the dread associated with disease had with respect to social and behavioral and policy aspects, right? So the dread, the morbidity would lead to policy interventions, would lead to behavioral change at the individual level. And of course, that had an impact to influence the disease progression. So our system dynamics model basically started from the traditional SEIR model, right? So susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. Now, when we think about the basic structure of the SEIR model, we can also think of a number of feedback processes that lead to the spread of the disease. And so if we think about reinforcing loops R1, R2, so the contagion through the exposed, the contagion through the infected, they basically generate the exponential growth experience in the early stages of the disease. We can also think that if left unchecked, the balancing loop B1 depletion would limit the spread of the disease once the susceptible population would have been depleted enough. Naturally, in the beginning of the disease, the balancing loop B1 is very weak and not very effective in containing the growth associated with reinforcing loops R1 and R2. Now, what we know is that the infected leads to hospitalizations and they lead to deaths, both people that die out of hospital, those that die in the ward, and both the increased number of deaths as the increasing number of confirmed cases increases the dread associated with the disease, influencing the implementation of policy interventions as well as individual behavioral change that limit the infectivity. This is effectively captured in the social distancing loop B2. And at least early on, a number of countries implemented these balancing policies that were much more effective in limiting the number of contacts and containing the exponential growth. Now, in the hospital, we can see that typically patients enter through the general ward. This is a typical case, but very acute, very severe cases, they go directly to ICU and they eventually return to the ward. They either die or can recover. And it's important to capture the stock and flow diagram. Now, while our initial model built upon the traditional SEIR, it's important to recognize that there were some specific aspects of COVID-19 that needed to be captured and that led to a model that is different than the SEIR. The first thing is that in addition to the pre-symptomatic, which here we are replacing for the exposed, the pre-symptomatic population, it's important to recognize for COVID-19 that a significant fraction of the population turns out to be asymptomatic. What does that mean? They never developed the symptoms. And so they have developed the antibodies, they have been infected, and they can infect others. However, they never developed the symptoms. Now, an interesting aspect is that initially in our modeling effort, we did not have any information on the asymptomatic infectious population. So most of the data was downstream. And by downstream, I mean that the information associated with the data collected was on out-of-hospital death rates, in-hospital death rates, hospital admissions, discharges. We had hospitalizations, so we have data on the stock. So, and then of course we had partial information on the recovered population. What do I mean by partial information? Well, we had the cumulative discharges, so we have the cumulative number associated with the discharges, but we didn't have information on the symptomatic population. We didn't have information on the asymptomatic. So it's very difficult also to get information on the self-recovery rates and the asymptomatic recoveries and the cumulative levels associated with those flows. So what I mean upstream is that we didn't have information on the infection rate. We didn't have information on the progressing to asymptomatic and symptomatic. We didn't have information on those stocks, only partial from these. The information that we had related to downstream. Now, as many countries invested in serological surveys, basically we could at different points in time get more information on the asymptomatic infectious, the symptomatic infectious, the cumulative infected. Now, for a sample of the population that were tested and they were surveyed through this serological aspect. So, wonderful aspect of this work has been the data collection. The data required to get information downstream required significant integration across different hospitals. And as you can imagine, different units of hospitals, even though they're all public or a majority may be public, they keep data in independent and different ways. They use different systems, and at times they collect data in different periods, so that integration becomes a significant challenge. Even when you are able to integrate and aggregate the data taking away some inconsistencies across different units, well, you lack data upstream. And this has only been possible through serological surveys that have been conducted later. Now, in addition to include the asymptomatic infectious, our model moves beyond the SEIR by integrating the hospital dynamics and also the feedback that influences the behavioral dynamics. So either through social distancing that is captured endogenous and the dread associated with both deaths and the confirmed cases. This picture here also gives you a sense of the choice of model that aim to focus on the R0 and a specific infection duration. Traditionally, we may try also to get a sense of contact frequency and contact rates, and those are difficult to estimate at an aggregate level, and they may require some different types of arrays to capture the specific types of contact frequencies for different cohorts, age cohorts or different types of employment and so on. We have adopted a R0 with an uncontrolled transmission rate approach because the language was better understood and more accepted by public health officials and medical clinicians that were basically consuming the results of the model. Now, naturally, these insights or the model has to be faithful to the original idiosyncrasies that are relevant for the policymakers. In particular, we had to take into consideration the data that was relevant for the East of England, and then you basically make use of very different data sets to arrive at the different types of variables associated with the downstream data, such as neoconfirmed cases, hospital admissions, hospital discharges, in-hospital deaths, and out-of-hospital deaths. Suffice it to say that our first attempt at integrating everything identified significant inconsistencies that required at least 6 weeks of additional work to try to resolve those inconsistencies, such that we could find aggregated solutions. The model calibrated to the regional data allowed us to estimate some important parameters, such as the real-time reproduction number, the effectiveness of social distancing measures, the fractions of positive tests and hospitalization, admissions, hospitalized discharges, as well as estimating some characteristics of the disease, such as incubation time, illness, recovery time, the duration of hospitalization, and so on. Now, here is just to give you a sense of the fit of the model calibrated to data. This is the data for new daily hospital admissions for the East of England, so aggregated across different STPs. And what we have here is that, what we did was basically calibrate the model to the historical data, and then we projected forward. Now, typically, we had a validation period of 1 week where we collected data. So we basically had the model calibrated to the past. We had a holdout period of 1 week where we had data, but we didn't include in the model. And then we projected and finally compared our projections with the holdout data. That is given by the dots here that are the actuals. And then 1 week forward, we basically ran sensitivity analysis with either pessimistic or optimistic scenarios, so ranging univariate or multivariate sensitivity analysis to project the likely scenarios associated with the behavior of the disease. And this helped us to do some more interesting and more important what-if scenarios. So here is one scenario with the East of England intensive care unit beds that basically there was concern, for instance, at the end of the disease about the possible removal of social distancing measures. And then what would be the likelihood of actually getting a second wave of hospitalizations? As I speak today, in addition to the work that I have been doing in the East of England, I have been modeling the dynamics of the disease in Switzerland, in particular with a regional focusing in the Canton Ticino in the south of Switzerland. And I have been meeting with the Ministry of Health locally, the cantonal medical doctor, the head of the public health services, and right now we're in the middle of a second wave that is remarkably lower in terms of its impact with respect to hospitalization and deaths. And we, even though we are in the second wave, we are looking at the implications for public policy. And naturally, at the early time, there was this concern with balancing the policy associated with the epidemiological progression as with the policy associated with the economic implications of those policies, right? So ultimately, government officials were influenced or were trying to find a balance associated with the impact of the disease, right, in terms of deaths, and the impact of the policies implemented with respect to the economic impact. So what are some of the lessons learned of this work? And naturally, there are a lot of lessons associated with the model and associated with the calibration efforts, the sensitivity analysis, the specifics of the disease. But I actually like to focus on some societal benefits and some implications of doing this type of work. So first, I'd like to mention the need for a regional scope. What does that mean? Well, that ultimately to arrive at effective operational decisions at the regional level and empowering public officials at that level, we need to work directly with them, right? So there might be decisions that take place at the national levels, but the regional scope is important and it offers an opportunity for intervention and contribution. The other thing is champions are key. One of the key individuals in our team, Anis Pari, so he actually was a member of the national national public health system, and he was a champion of system dynamics. One of the professors at the Judge, Stefan Scholz, also had a wonderful prior relationship with Public Health England, and both of these people were champions, but they were internal champions that basically helped to move the effort within the organization, and this was key for our success. In addition to that, we emphasize the need for trust and transparency, precisely because we had a prior relationship with Public Health England, and the this was not starting from scratch. We basically built on the existing trust, and we built on truthful communication, transparent evaluations. It was less about defending our models and more about facilitating information sharing, enabling active understanding of the assumptions embedded in these models, and an effective communication so that people could understand whether the solution that was offered was useful to them. Next, we really put a lot of focus on the client's need. And by that, it was basically the models that we tried to create, the research questions that we tried to answer resonated, were dictated by the decision makers, not us. Of course, we had, as researchers, we had ideas of possible items that would be interesting, but the successful implementation of our approach resonated directly with the fact that the decision makers were bought in to what we were offering. So they had a specific interest, and we could contribute to answer those interests. The other thing, naturally, this is to focus on the problem, not on the method. Now, while I focused on the system dynamics contribution, I really wanted to show you the other three methods and the other three approaches, because ultimately we had a problem. There was a phenomenon taking place, a phenomenon that dictated a number of different types of questions. And if we were approaching it intrinsically with one method, it might not have sufficed to actually arrive at at interesting answers. So instead, we had a different approach, which I recognize that that is not traditional in academic endeavors, but for us, it really yielded very positive results. And finally, we learned that it was really important to collaborate and solve in real time. Right, so we felt that it was precisely this ability to react in real time and to have a collaborative problem-solving approach that allowed us to inform decision maker. So this is in sharp contrast with traditional academic approach, where you focus on a problem and you spend weeks honing in on the exact flavor of the problem, and then you spend another multiple months focusing on the literature and understanding what different authors have done and so on, and it may be actually 1 year before you come up with some insights. Instead, we had a very stressful but a very collaborative work, where we were meeting for 3-4 hours on a regular basis, including Saturday, Sunday, and so on. Now, of course, we were faced with a crisis, and we were hoping to inform decision making. So that required this type of collaborative, real-time problem solving. And to wrap up, it's important to mention that instead of trying to arrive at this perfect fully rigorous model, we strove to find a balance, right, between rigor and relevance. And I think that by informing, by trying to have this balance, we were able to inform actual decisions. So I wanted to thank you for your attention. We have a paper that summarizes the model and summarizes the work in more detail. The paper is available in SSRN. I'm showing you here the front page of that paper. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a fantastic conference. Thank you and goodbye.
Felicitaciones, fue una excelente presentación. No olvides responder las dudas e inquietudes que nuestros oyentes se realizarán por medio de la herramienta interactiva Slack.
El día de hoy vengo a dejarles una invitación muy especial y es a participar en el Congreso Latinoamericano de Dinámica de Sistemas, CLADS 2020. Será en octubre, modalidad virtual. Creo que es una excelente oportunidad para desde cualquier parte del mundo unirnos y participar, para estudiar cómo diferentes problemas complejos pueden abordarse desde el pensamiento sistémico, desde la dinámica de sistemas, en áreas como energía, salud, transporte, economía, en fin. Y podamos seguir creciendo en comunidad, fortaleciendo redes de conocimiento, de trabajo. Entonces, los espero a todos en octubre y un abrazo.